everyone, and welcome to TIU Global Dialogue. My name is Sojin Shin, an assistant professor of political economy at Tokyo International University. It is my great pleasure to serve as a moderator for the third session of TIU Global Dialogue on the COVID-19 pandemic and the economy. Global Dialogue is our new speaker series to discuss many fields of international affairs with the top experts, academics, and policy practitioners. Today, we invited three outstanding economists from Tokyo International University, Professors Christopher Edmonds, Samuel Lamponsa, and Jiawei Chen for a panel discussion. The session will proceed with the three presentations from each speaker for the next 45 minutes. It will be followed by the final 15-minute wrap-up session where the three speakers review the discussion with some suggestions on lasting effects and the overall situation of the global economy. Thus, I requested the audience to leave questions and comments on the chat board during the presentations so that the panelists can address the questions during the final wrap-up session. Without more ado, I would like to invite today's first speaker, Professor Christopher Edmonds. Professor Edmonds is an economist at TIU. Before joining TIU in 2017, his post included jobs with the Asian Development Bank, the University of Hawaii Manoa, the East-West Center, and the International Rice Research Institute. He has published many papers in refereed journals and written a few books. He holds degrees from the University of California, Berkeley, the University of Chicago, and Cornell University. You can find more information on Professor Edmonds at his website at sites.google.com, which we provide on the chat board. Professor Edmonds, welcome. And now the floor is yours.
So good morning, everyone, and thanks for taking time out of your Wednesday to attend this session. So I will try to give you a quick overview of the status of the COVID-19 pandemic and its effects on the economy using the slides, which I hope you can see at this time. So I'm just going to go into full presentation mode. So, some of the big questions that we are going to try to give some insights into during the next hour are how deep is the economic crisis as currently measured? What is the likely shape and duration of the expected recovery from COVID-19, both in its immediate impacts that it's having while the pandemic is underway, as well as what will happen once we do come up with a solution to the pandemic. What lessons have been learned from the pandemic, both expected and unexpected, and what are some of the expected lasting economic effects of the pandemic? To summarize, it's very unlikely that the world economy that emerges after 2020 and going into 2021 will there will be some probably permanent changes that we'll see coming to the economy. So, that's it. That was, my slide was out of order. It's a little strange. I'm not sure. So in terms of just what's happening with the COVID-19 pandemic, I suppose everyone is watching these trends, and we see, it's very much a current trend, and actually the numbers of new infections, the numbers of deaths that are being experienced around the world are now higher than they've ever been since the start of the crisis early this year. We see that the crisis in terms of number of cases is most severe in Europe in terms of number, but perhaps most severe in terms of the propensity or the frequency of infection and ill effects in the Americas, focused on the situation in the United States. Okay. So again, this is this is all information from the World Health Organization website. So again, it's giving us a good status of the COVID-19 pandemic. And this chart, as shown, is just showing sort of the number of cases, the frequency of cases across the countries of the world, with the dark blue countries being the places where the pandemic is most severe, while lighter colors reflect where the countries that have been had less difficulty managing the crisis. With these numbers, of course, there is a concern about reporting and the consistency of reporting across countries. Okay. And this is a similar chart just showing the number of deaths around the world from COVID. So I think all the speakers in this presentation will accept that COVID is not a hoax, that it's a very serious thing, that governments need to deal with it. And I guess from the perspective of economists, sometimes we're taken into fields that aren't really our areas of comfort, like COVID-19, where there's such an intricate link between what is happening epidemiologically with respect to the disease and what is happening economically to different countries, where that close linkage is just a reality of the day that we're living through. Okay, so again, looking at the situation of individual countries, you can see that this diversity of experience across countries. And the main factors tend to be how seriously the country takes public health measures to stem the flow of virus, in terms of simple things from mask wearing to complete economic shutdowns. Okay. And this in turn is leading to different effects of COVID-19 on the economies in the countries. When you have to go to a full shutdown of the economy, stay-at-home orders, obviously that's having very severe impacts on the economies. Particularly as economists study it, there's particular sectors of the economy where there's much, human-to-human interaction is a much bigger part of that sector of the economy. I'm thinking particularly about the service sector, where options for remote working and working from home are more limited. Okay, so this is obviously during the first 3 quarters of the year, the COVID-19 pandemic has had very serious declines in growth. There's a podcast, it's a somewhat dated podcast, but there's a link to that. So just looking at what happened to the US economy according to the best available data, it shows that by the second quarter, there had been more than a 30% decline in the estimated sum total of the estimated value of goods and services produced in the US economy. And again, that sort of decline is almost historically unprecedented, as big as or even larger than the declines that were experienced in 1929 following the Great Depression. Okay, and looking at the latest data on what has happened in the third quarter of the year, the months, July, August, September, you see this diversity of declines as well. But again, very serious declines across all these countries, India, United Kingdom, South Africa, Turkey, while other countries were already on the recovery. So this again is coming off. So this is a quarter-on-quarter change in the rate of growth across countries, coming off those massive declines that we're seeing in almost all economies in the second quarter of the year. So governments, obviously, various governments have taken a number of measures to address the COVID-19 pandemic. These take the form of fiscal measures where the governments are explicitly increasing their spending, increasing the number of transfers to their citizens in an effort to sort of stem the reduction in demand that will result from all the unemployment that is being caused by the pandemic. So that is a traditional Keynesian measure to finance all this spending by governments, all these transfers from governments. Of course, it requires the governments to go into increase their levels of debt, to issue more basically loans to whoever will buy them. So we've seen a very sharp increase in the level of debt, and we'll come back to that at the end of the presentation. In addition to the fiscal measures, we've seen central banks around the world take extremely aggressive measures to try to stimulate economic growth and prompt investment through monetary measures, including unprecedentedly much more drastic increase in the amount of activity that central banks are doing in the asset markets in countries in the face of the zero lower bound on traditional monetary stimulus measures. Employers as well as governments have taken a number of human resource measures and employment measures to try to minimize the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on unemployment in countries. Nonetheless, one of the most severe symptoms we're seeing around the world as a result of the pandemic is drastic rises in the level of unemployment across countries. And again, something Professor Lamponsa will talk about is how that you see that that's very different across sectors of the economy, with some sectors like international tourism virtually shut down, while other sectors, the IT sector or online retailing, actually expanding as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And there have been a few efforts at regional cooperation, even in the face of very lackluster participation in that by some of the larger countries in the world, and as well as some environmental measures. And there's a report by the OECD that does the best job that I've seen in terms of detailing all these efforts across countries. So I will share the link to that measure. Unfortunately, you can't get simple measures of, what is the total amount of stimulus that different countries, fiscal stimulus, or a measure of the total amount of monetary stimulus that central banks are doing. But both of them are on the increase. Both of them are sort of raising the level of debt in the global economy, pushing the global economy away from sort of pushing its imbalances even further than they were before. Okay, so again, the widespread deficit spending, expansionary fiscal policy. So far, this has not caused increases in interest rates or inflation, as there seems to be ample investor appetite for government bonds. But the concern is that these balance of payment deficits are growing rapidly. And this comes on the back of a lot of similar policies that were undertaken during the global financial crisis in 2008 and 2009. And it's just putting us in a position of sort of higher level of international financial risk than existed before. So everything is fine as long as the debt can keep expanding, as long as the lenders are willing to keep increasing the amount that they loan. The problem is what happens if all of a sudden people become a little more conservative or start demanding repayment on that debt at a more rapid rate. Then that could sink the global economy into a very deep recession. Okay, so this is where this issue of debt to GDP. Again, and this chart is just showing a map of the government debt to GDP ratios around the world. Not a useful chart because all the interesting stuff that is really happening is in that 100% or more, but you see a huge diversity in how much over 100% various countries have gone. And just a similar chart showing countries. And you can see are having a bit of trouble seeing that last chart. Oh, it's interesting, Japan doesn't seem to be on this chart. Japan is actually one of the countries with the highest debt to GDP ratios on the planet. Okay, so again, this is just a quick review. I'm trying to stay within 15 minutes and then we'll come back and talk more later at the conclusions. But the key is how well countries have dealt with their COVID-19 outbreaks are playing a key role in driving how deep the economic downturn is. So again, we're economists, but now we have to become epidemiologists because of the link. That said, there is a diversity of experiences. So Japan, for example, compared to other countries has been very, very, I mean, I think one of the great success stories on the planet in terms of minimizing the amount to which they have disrupted normal economic activity, while at the same time maintaining control of the COVID-19 pandemic. While Europe and the United States have suffered a much greater extent. So Europe has, now they're being forced into a new round of pretty complete economic shutdowns of their economies in the face of rapidly rising case numbers. The US has largely avoided the worst impacts from COVID-19 to date as a result of the extreme central bank stimulus of the economy, of an extremely large fiscal stimulus that was done early in the pandemic, and sort of an unwillingness to deal with the pandemic. So continuing economic activity, even in the face of very drastic rises in the number of cases. But I frankly don't see that as being sustainable. You can't have those numbers of infected people, that number of deaths persist indefinitely before it starts to impact your economy. A key thing that will determine what happens to these economies and to the global economy as a whole is, what's happening with the vaccine or treatments. And we received some very hopeful news yesterday or the day before with some promising vaccine trials. So maybe we're at the end. Maybe there's some hope there. But again, there's this great diversity of country experiences. Ironically, so to me, the one big takeaway is if governments really wish to minimize the economic impact of COVID, then they need to figure out ways to control the virus first. So think about the virus first, then think about restoring your economy. Don't get that confused. And some governments clearly have done so. So, oh, sorry, I thought I was done. Just recognize that historically, when the global economy goes into recession, we see that these recessions take various shapes. And this slide is just sort of reviewing recent experience with past recession. And the real fear with COVID-19 is that we are heading for an L-shaped recovery, such as what Japan suffered in the 1990s, where you get a persistent fall in the level of economic activity, and basically your very long path back to recovery, while the hope is that we would get a V-shaped response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Okay, so I'll pass the slide over to Sam at this point. We'll come back and talk more about these grand polemics in terms of what's likely to happen with COVID-19 in the future. Okay, so Sam, I'll stop.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Professor Edmonds, for overviewing many economic and financial problems the pandemic caused. Now, I would like to invite Professor Samuel Lamponsa. Professor Lamponsa is also an economist at TIU. He is the former president of the African Finance and Economics Association, current board chair of the association, and associate editor for the Journal of African Development. He published various journal articles addressing financial institutions and development issues in Ghana. You can find more information on his publications from TIU's Institute for International Strategy website that we provide on the chat board. Professor Lamponsa, welcome. And now the floor is yours.
So my presentation will take us through developments in the commodity market. I think it is important to look at the commodity market because a lot of the emerging economies and emerging and developing economies depends on commodities to at least sustain their economies. And as we started with this COVID-19 pandemic, what we saw was a demand shock. And the demand shock basically arose from the restrictions that were put in place. For example, social distancing. And the social distancing restriction in terms of oil, if we take it as the first commodity, brought a sharp reduction. But other commodities also experienced similar declines, and it has a very different, it varied in different magnitudes for different commodities. if we start with oil, what we saw was that there was a coordination between OPEC, Russia, and the US, and that coordination led to almost 10% cut in oil production. The reduction in the oil production kind of arrested the decline in oil prices. As of May, production has reduced from 100 million barrels per day to about 88 million barrels per day. So at that time, it was about 12%. However, consumption also dropped about 30%, and bringing the two together saw a reduction in price, as we are going to see later. Other commodities also experienced similar reduction, and these commodities, especially developing countries, basically depend on them to fund their fiscal responses to the COVID-19 crisis, which means with the low commodity prices, there will be pressure on these nations, and they will be experiencing more deficit than the normal times. Commodity importers, on the other hand, and consumers saw a drop in prices, which in essence means that they will have some kind of disinflationary impact, and that will help them to ease pressure on households and also government budgets. If we try to look at some figures, this slide here provides us the commodity price index, and this is monthly index between January and 1919 and then September 2020. So what we can see from here is a sharp drop in energy as the drop in oil detected. And then when we look at consumption, what we see here also is a sharp drop in production, as I explained earlier on. So although around June there was about 30% drop, but about 15% drop, but we saw a recovery as the nation started to at least recover from the impact or started to ease up from the COVID-19 restriction. So with the energy sector, we saw prices rebounding in the third quarter of 2020. And then crude prices also started to rebound. The average was around $41 per barrel in September, which has moved from the low $21 per barrel in April. And relative to the fall in oil prices during the global financial crisis, the most recent decline was a little steeper, but also saw a fast recovery. And my next slide will show that. Once again, the recovery in crude oil may be short-lived because, as we've all seen, we've started seeing a new outbreaks of COVID-19 in different countries. And as we are entering the winter, probably the outbreak might be increasing. And if that happens, we don't know what governments will do, and probably consumption will once again reduce. There were similar declines in natural gas and coal, but these two commodities also saw recovery in the third quarter of 2020. So over here, we can see a comparison between the global financial crisis, which is blue, and then COVID-19. And what this price index is indicating is that COVID-19 saw a sharp or a steeper decline, but a sharp recovery, unlike what we saw for the global financial crisis. Also, if we take one other commodity like metal prices, there was a sharp decline, not that much compared to what we saw in the global financial crisis. I think the metal prices is index is indicating a much more rapid recovery than any other commodity that we will look at over here. So if you look at non-energy prices, overall, it rose by 10% in the third quarter of 2020. And this was detected by metals and mineral price index, which rose by 20% on quarter on quarter. Most metal prices at current are above their pre-pandemic levels. And this recovery is basically robust in China, which has led or recovered from COVID and seen a surge in consumption of metal. So once again, as I said, if we compare to the global financial crisis, the rebound in metals and mineral market is much more faster than what we saw in the global financial crisis. In the case of precious metals, we can talk about a sharp rise, and this is boosted by depreciation in the US dollar and also lower interest rate. And when we take agricultural commodity prices, we saw a rise of 6% in the third quarter of 2020. But there is divergence between broad staple grain prices and rising prices of other agricultural commodities. One thing that we can look at is food inflation and the issue of poverty. COVID-19 measures kind of started with what various governments were trying to reduce the impact of the spread or reduce the spread of the disease. And as such, they started with this social distancing and also lockdown measures. Those measures kind of affected food supply availability in the local levels. And these changes that we saw in food supply brought in prices rising in the localities. When the lockdown was eased, local prices improved, but we also saw prices in other places kind of increasing. So in some countries, while the local prices improved, depreciation of currencies increased the cost of imported food and agricultural inputs, and that resulted in increase in local prices. So if we take the net effect, we see persistent food price inflation in several emerging markets and developing economies. For example, if we take South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America, the average inflation in these regions exceeded 8% during January to August period. And that will be year on year compared to 2.8% last year. So what is the effect of this? The effect of the food price increase is increase in poverty or increase in malnourishment. So we have reduction in income, which is due to COVID, plus higher domestic food prices, and this will be equal to poverty and undernourishment. According to a preliminary assessment by the Food and Agriculture Organization, the COVID-19 pandemic may add about 83 to 132 million people to the global number of undernourished in this particular year. The figure stood at 690 million before the pandemic. And over here, we can see the how agricultural index moved between June and September. So in June, the price was high, it reduced. In January, the price was around 89, 88, and then it reduced and then rose back to 114 in September. That is why we have the food price, domestic food prices increasing over time. And this, we can see much more divergence across regions. So in Southeast Asia region, in Sub-Saharan Africa, and then when we take the global index, it is around 3%. And this figure here is showing us the number of undernourished people in the world. And as I said earlier, around 2019, it was around 690 million people. So we are going to get about 132 million people added to this figure. Other commodities that we can look at are the beverage commodities, especially coffee and also cocoa and tea. And in this market, we saw price declining over time when pandemic started, especially in the case of coffee. We saw price of Arabica and also coffee Robusta declining, but over time, when we saw more demand for coffee, the price for Robusta started to rise. On the other hand, for cocoa, there was a fall in price because of the shock of COVID. People thought that demand for cocoa will reduce over time. And as such, prices started to decline. But it became stable from May onward until it declined again in June and then started to rise again. So cocoa prices at present has recovered to about 14% in March, but it trembled about 14% in March, but has recovered and remained stable throughout, but not to the level of the pandemic period. When we consider grinding of cocoa beans, it fell by 9% in the second quarter of 2020. And I'm sure that led to this significant reduction of 14% that we see here. One other thing that we can consider is coffee production and cocoa production. And for this year, we are going to see about 5% increase in cocoa production. And this increase is basically coming from Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana that will have 5 and 7% respectively. When we look at the precious metal, once again, it gained about 16.5% in the third quarter of 2020. And the surge in prices reflected a flight to safe haven assets. If we compare the ultra lower interest rate that we have from major banks, and also the expansionary monetary policies that governments are using to ease the impact of COVID-19. And also we have a weakening of the US dollars and also supply disruptions that has created this safe haven for investors in terms of precious metals. So gold gained 12% in the third quarter of 2020, reaching an all-high of $2,067 an ounce in August 2020. And the World Bank predicts that the average price will be around 27% higher in this particular year. So here we present two slides that shows the momentum in gold prices and comparing that with a correlation of the US, the 10-year real interest rate and also the US dollar. We see that this basically shows that the interest rate has continued to be low, and as such, people trust investing in gold than investing in the US dollar or the US bonds. One other thing that I would like to show here is on the global level, what will be the impact? We see a sharp decline in GDP growth across nations for the year 2020, although it is predicted that the growth will rebound in 2021, but we are not sure how this will happen if we consider the present impact of COVID coming to the winter with the new increases in the COVID numbers. And when we consider the number of countries that have seen or gone into recession, we have almost about 99 countries, 99% of countries going into recession because of COVID-19. One last thing that I would like to stress on are how the COVID-19 is affecting Sub-Saharan Africa. If you look at this slide, we see that for 2020, growth will be around -2% for Sub-Saharan Africa and other emerging markets and developing economies. And what is interesting is that if you look here, you see that public consumption is the only item on this table that is positive. which means that government are going to support their local economies because of COVID-19. Lastly, one thing that helps most developing countries will be remittance. And if we look at the year-on-year changes in remittance, we see a strong negative growth in remittance for all developing economies, especially Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, I will end here so that Professor Chan will continue, and then we'll come back to discuss going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Lamponsa, for a very interesting presentation. Professor Lamponsa presented how price change of natural resources and food will affect the low accessibility and problems to the citizens in developing countries in Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Well, now I would like to invite Professor Jawar Chan for his presentation. Professor Chen is also an economist at TIU. He works on both applied and theoretical econometrics, causal machine learning, and empirical finance. More information on Professor Chen's research is available at TIU's Institute for International Strategy website that we provide on the chat board. Professor Chen, welcome. And now the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here. So first, let me talk about the roadmap of my presentation today. So I'm going to talk about three things. So the first thing I'll talk about is where the health measures. So you think about the lockdown or the wearing the mask. It's going to contain the COVID-19 effective or not. Okay. So there's a subsection here is I talk about the policy stringency. And why I got talk about something called the health measure stringency is you would think about some countries, they implement the lockdown. Okay, so you might think that you want to see where the implement lockdown or not have the impact on containing, for example, containing the COVID-19. But also in some countries, the wearing the mask is just a political statement. Okay, so we need more variation. So basically we're going to use a variable that will take in value between 0 and 100. So you think about the index to capture the health measures stringency. Okay. In particular, I talk about a thesis. So it's written by Rivaldo. He was an undergraduate student from TIU. She graduated in August of this year. He wrote his thesis under my supervision. And I have realized he got a job from this company. Okay. And then the second thing I talk about is the impact of COVID-19 on the subgroups of society. So there's something related to the inequality. I put the subtitle here. Okay. And that's important because once we know the heterogeneous effects, so the COVID-19 is going to bring the different effects on the subgroups of a society, and then we can design more effective policy for driving path of recovery. Okay, so that's going to be the last session about the policy implications. So in particular, my presentation is based on the following two papers. Okay, so the first one is the TIU undergraduate thesis written by the Rivaldo. Another one is a forthcoming paper that's gonna be published in Journal of Public Economics. So they talk about the inequalities across many dimensions. I'm gonna show you some graphs about what's the impact if you look at the different age, different the gender, occupation, and these kind of things. Okay. And why I gotta do that? Because that when we talk about the policy, we would like to do something called the evidence-based policy making, EBPM. Okay, we're going based on the rigorous evidence, based on the data and also the research design, and then we can convince people that's going to be the more reasonable the thing the government should implement. So this one is about the efficacy of policy, the health measure stringency in containing COVID-19. So basically we use 124 countries data Okay, so we got made our own data set, and we got have so many variables ready to house economic and demographic variables in those countries. So I'm talking about the panel data. Okay, so basically we create our own data and by merging the following data sets. Okay. So we have so many variables in our data, but the thing we care about is you can think about two variables. We are particularly interested in is you want to figure out what's the impact of stringency on the mortality. That's one of the outcome variable. This notation delta is the change in stringency and change in the mortality. Okay. In terms of econometric, the models, actually you think about this equation is a panel data model. So you want to estimate this beta. Okay, it's going to capture the effect of the stringency on the mortality. But this beta definitely depends on what kind of variable you include in your model, because you want to constrain for things that were related to stringency and mortality. So we provide a data-driven way to pick up those important variables and there's something on the strategy called the double machine learning method procedure that's widely used in economics in the recent decade. And also for something we don't really have the data, and we're using something called the factor structure to capture, for example, the culture, different culture, and the effect, or because the COVID-19 shock is time varying. So you try to capture this time varying unobserved effects. It may look technical, but it turns out not, because you will learn those tools if you TIU student from the econometrics course and also the machine learning in economics course. So the bottom line here is you can look at the column H. Okay, so the target variable is this stringency. So you can look at this coefficient. It's negative and it's significantly different from 0. This means yes, the stringency, this kind of house measure, indeed they contain the COVID-19 things, especially you think about outcome variable is the change in mortality. And you also see a bunch of variable pops up here. There are important variables selected by the double machine learning procedure. And for example, you think it's kind of reasonable, you should control for the dependence ratio because it's about the population, the structure, and also something that related to testing policy. But I think most interesting thing is the algorithm pick up two variables. It's something called the trust index. Okay, so there's an index for the trust in politicians. So you think about trust in government, and in fact that's also can decrease the outcome variable. Okay, so that's the main finding from this paper. So basically, the health measure, this kind of stringency policy, indeed can contain the COVID-19 effectively. And now let's move to the second paper to talk about the heterogeneous effect of the COVID-19. So we talk about the inequality. So basically they're using survey data. So there's a 3 survey waves they conducted in US and UK, and also the 1 survey wave in Germany. Okay, and the novel thing they have in this research is in the survey, they ask the survey respondents a variable is called a share or job task. Okay, they could be do from home. Okay, so again, it's also a continuous random variable. It's gone between 0 and 100. So you think about it's a scale. Once we have this data, so you could think first they look at the impact, okay, on across this dimension about the task done from home. And if you look at lower quantile, that means you look at the people, they couldn't have much of a task. They need to really get the things done in, for example, in their company. Okay. And they suffer most. So that you can see this kind of effect in US, also in UK. Okay. So the thing I want to highlight here is you look at horizontal axis is the ratio, the capture, the task done from home. Okay. So you're gonna see the impact will depends on the percentage of the task you can do from home or not. And they also show you, you may wonder maybe US and UK, they are different countries, but it turns out when you look at this variable work from home, US and UK, they look, this variable or the old society in US and UK, they look similar. So we know the work from home is an important variable. They will see where you got be impacted by the COVID-19 or not. But you also could look at the effect across the industry. Even you can do something work from home. So if, particularly if you look at the rectangles in rate, there's the US data. So you see the industry that was affected most is this industry accommodation and the food services. And for example, if you're in industry information and communication, you suffer this. Okay. But you also can, even you look at the industry, and then you also can see the across different occupations. So you also see this kind of heterogeneous effects. Okay. So the takeaway so far is that depends on the ability of work from home, and also it depends on your work in what kind of industry and also occupation. And you might think about what the impact if you look at the income dimension. So you could think about the household income, right? So this graph shows you the horizontal axis is you sorting the household income from low to high, right? And the vertical axis here is a negative number. So you can see the low income household indeed suffer most when you compare with the wealthy household. Okay, so you see this kind of a thing happen in US and UK and also Germany. So there's one of the dimensions of heterogeneity. And now you could think about the gender. So in this research, they show you the women significantly more likely to have lost their job. But from the previous slides, you see the impact may have a different impact across occupation and industry, and also, for example, the task and then from home. But once you have the panel data, you can run a regression. You can control for the occupation and the individual fixed effect. Also, you control for the task from home. But you still see the woman, they significantly more likely to lose their job. So you see that those numbers are highlighted here, underlined in red, is a positive number, significantly different from 0. And the outcome variable is the probability of losing their job. And the female is a dummy variable. It's 1, it can be the female, otherwise male. Okay. And something interesting about the finding, but they don't have a good story about that, is even you look at the household, both husband and wife, they are working from home. But when you look at the hours spent per day on children amongst, for example, the child care and homeschooling, the wife is still doing a relative more job on that. Okay, because we expand the husband part, they working from home, they can share some this kind of child care things, but it turns out not. Okay, so we based on these two, the findings from these two papers, and we can talk about some policy implications, and particularly if you think about the workers, and we see there's some persistence happen. So we should do some investment and meant to increase the ability to work from home, okay, to create an environment more friendly to, for example, to the workers, they can complete the task working from home, or for example, the online learnings when we talk about the schools. Okay, so there's already two improvements in existing technologies. Okay, so let's conclude my talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Chen, for your interesting talk. Professor Chen presented the impact of pandemic on the job market and industry with some observations on gender disparity as well. Well, now I would like to invite our three panelists to wrap up this session with some final suggestions and concluding remarks. In this session, the speakers will be able to address the questions and comments from the audience. Professor Adamant?
Okay, I think I've shared the slide again. Can you confirm that you're seeing that?
Yes, we can see
okay,
that.
Okay, so these are just some final slides. So, and very much related to the excellent question we got. So I hope the session so far has sort of given you insights at different levels, going from the macro level to more micro level understanding of the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. And one of the questions we had said were, you know, basically we can see that there will be some lasting effects on industry. So in particular, we see that there will be, you know, some industries that are particularly human to human interaction based, mostly in the service sector, that are likely to undergo permanent shrinkage or permanent transformation. And in that regard, I would point to the international tourism industry. Again, in the early days of the early months of this year, it was really through international travel that the pandemic was able to spread. And I have some figures on the extent to which that industry is essentially shut down this year. At the same, so particularly business tourism is unlikely to ever recover. Cruise tourism might have been dealt a death blow with COVID-19. That said, another overall impact that Professor Chen spoke a lot about is just that the COVID-19 pandemic, as the way it's played out, has really spurred inequality. That again, this was a trend that was worrying before COVID-19 hit us. It's only been exacerbated by it. That said, there are some sectors that we've seen very strong growth in, and that's actually reflected in a lot of the equity markets around the world that are doing quite well in spite of COVID-19. In particular, the IT industries have proven very resilient and very useful in adapting to COVID-19. This move towards remote work arrangements and incentives for employers to substitute automation for workers are probably trends that, you know, have been spurred by COVID-19, are likely to continue. Okay. But just, yeah, I'm not going to go over these slides in detail because we're almost at our final minutes, but just sharing some slides showing the severity of the impact on international tourism. Just that, you know, it's an industry that's completely devastated. Unfortunately, it's an industry that's quite important across different economies of the world, particularly, you know, and where you have economies that are relying on tourism, it's going to be a very serious problem for them going ahead. So just some data. Again, I don't think it's necessary for me to detail them, but I'm also providing, if you're interested in looking at tourism, where to do that. Again, the bigger concern is that there's actually been surprising resilience in the global economy in the face of COVID. So the success of these stimulus measures has been, I think, even exceeded expectations. So the downturn hasn't been as severe as we might have feared. The resilience of global supply chains in the face of the economic disruptions caused by COVID have been really surprising. But all that rests, the ability of that to continue really rests upon the continued stability in international financial markets. And that's what is somewhat being thrown in doubt by the rising global imbalances, the rising levels of total debt that different countries are accumulating. So there's a diversity of opinion across economists about these debt levels and whether the unsustainable balances are sustainable. So on one hand, you have people like Paul Krugman that says, well, as long as interest rates low and there's an appetite for investors to keep taking on more and more debt, we're not in any trouble. On the other hand, you have people like Nouriel Roubini, Barry Eichengreen, I can't even remember one of my professors from Berkeley, Ken Rogoff, very pessimistic. So the most serious one might be what Nouriel Roubini, who's a macroeconomist from NYU, he points to the 10 Ds, about these 10 long-term trends that are really leading to what he says is going to be a very serious recession coming up once all this stimulus takes place. And he's pointing to a number of factors that are facing the global economy that make that recession look very likely. Again, the key is the longer the pandemic persists, the more stimulus governments have to pump into their economies to try to maintain demand in the face of all the unemployment, all the lost income, all the knock-on effects in terms of reducing household demand for goods and services, the greater the ultimate recession will be. So I would encourage people to read the Nouriel Roubini pieces. I'm happy to share that. But again, understanding that we had these trends towards increasing debt, towards demographic issues in countries, towards climate change issues, towards deglobalization. These existed before COVID. COVID is only making them worse. And I'm trying to think, is that the last slide? Okay, so yeah, so here's some of the references. So those are my final statements. Let me give a little bit of time to Sam and Jawar as well.
Okay, thank you, Professor Lamponsa. Professor Lamponsa.
Okay, thank you very much. There is a question in the forum that I would like to address. It says, what are the challenges in the fiscal and monetary policies to deal with COVID-19 situation? Do you think the funding by government feasible in the long run if COVID-19 keeps on rising? This is a very important question. And I think for the key difficulty will be with the developing countries, emerging markets and developing countries. Because when we take the Western world, they are all dealing with this quantitative easing or what there's stimulus to keep the economies going. For developing countries, they receive some relief from the IMF and the World Bank, which is not enough. So the good thing is that with the prices in commodity reviving, that will give them some revenues going in there to support the economies. But if with the new increases in the number of COVID cases happening again, then we are going to see probably a decline in consumption for these industrial commodities. And when that happens, they will have difficulties servicing their external debts and also paying their external creditors. And that will be a key thing for them, which means their bonds will be weakened. And when their bonds are weakened and domestic mobilization is weak, they will come to a situation where they will not have people buying the government treasuries or bonds that they will issue, and that will have a long-lasting effect on the economies. So for advanced economies, I think they have the flexibility of pumping money into their own markets within their own economies. But for emerging markets and developing economies, that depends more on exports, be it raw materials or value added. When demand is low, it creates crisis for them. And in the long run, maybe in some countries, the debt will not be sustainable. And there will be the need for some bailing out for some countries. I think so.
Thank you, Professor Lamponsa, for your insight. Now I would like to invite Professor Chen.
Yeah. So Bassman talk is more emphasizing on the government, also the people, they should pay attention to the heterogeneous effect of this COVID-19 effect. So I think I probably can answer two questions were raised in the chat box. So the first one is, although the Yuki asked the Christopher to answer this question, so about the Japan's call to the travel policy, and he's wondering why it sounds like it's a little unfair of helping particular industry, right? And while taking the risk of rising cases in the countries. And so basically, you probably have so the graph I show you. So basically, the goal to 12 this policy is trying to target in the industry they suffer most. Right? So if you raise this kind of question, you also can say why we should help the poor household. They're just one subset of household, right? So that will depends on what's your goal and if you care about social welfare, and then there's something not we say is a little unfair. Another one is about the one talk about the debt issue. And it's saying that if we don't resolve the debt situation, and then we will see a double hit into the global economy. Yes. So, but if you worry about the debt issue at the current moment, and probably you think you want to deal with that, maybe there's some fiscal policy consolidation, but it takes time. So in the short run, we need to first get through this COVID-19 pandemic. Otherwise, you won't see the long run. Right? We are all dead here. So that's my personal opinion.
If I may.
Sure, please, Professor Edmonds, go ahead.
I mean, first I note that we're basically over time. So again, thank everyone for attending. That said, as long as people are interested, I think we're happy to go for another half hour if people want. I actually, I mean, and this might be the more interesting part where you get economists to disagree with one another. So I'm going to offer a slightly different take on what Sam was saying. So from my perspective, what makes me more nervous is what's going on with the OECD, the advanced industrial economies, and the fact that they have not been held to sort of fiscal or imbalance constraint. They found out ways, this magic potion that they can use to just keep increasing their levels of implicit debt in their economies without the sort of discipline, the market discipline that developing countries are faced. But as they do so, they're actually just raising the risk of a very deep, larger global recession. That's what, so actually I think I'm less worried about, I mean, the problem is, if that happens, it'll again be the developing countries that will be most severely affected. But I guess it's that expansion of implicit debt in all these economies, that sort of pushing these global imbalances to unforced, previously unseen levels that might lead to, a rapid contraction down the road. If all of a sudden the debt just can't be kept, you can't keep rolling over that debt. And if that happened, again, you'd see extreme exchange rate volatility, you'd see debt defaults and things like that. So I really see a lot of the OECD countries as sort of taking advantage of their privileged position in the global economy to sort of push their policies to favor their own citizens at the expense of other countries. And raising risk to the continued stability of the international financial system.
Yeah. I do agree with you, but you will also agree with me that because they have the power, and as you said, taking advantage of that power, they are not being checked. But for
Correct.
developing emerging economies and emerging markets and developing economies, they are always being checked. When your debt threshold goes beyond 70, you'll be characterized as a hippie country. But if we take a country like Japan, they have over 200% GDP ratio, debt ratio, but they are still, and the key is that, for example, Japan, the funding is mostly domestic. So they don't have that kind of international pressure that these emerging markets and developing economies will face when they don't check themselves. And for that reason, yes, the balance of power plays a very key role in this case. There was a question about the reason why gold prices is very high during this COVID period. The answer is very simple. Gold is usually seen as a safe haven when interest rates are low and when the US dollar is also losing value. And therefore, for this period, I think the price of gold is going up, as I showed on the slide, because the US dollar is weak and also the interest rate has been very low over the period.
Correct.
Thank you, Professor Lamponsa. There are a couple of more questions from our IR students. Yen asked, do you think the COVID-19 pandemic, its negative impact on the human-to-human services, more and more business will have the tendency to invest more on the technology to replace human beings in the post-pandemic period? Any speaker who would like to address the question?
Yeah, so
Please.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes.
So I think once people they raise this concern, they think about they would replace the human completely, but that's not the case. So they just maybe something in between. And also this kind of new technology will create a new type of jobs. So the point is the government, they should try to make the citizen to get familiar with this new technology, and also they can move into the new type of job. Okay, so that's my response.
Okay, thank you, Professor Chen. May I add a question to your panelist? Well, Professor Lamponsa shared his worries about the developing countries. And I think the developing countries, especially low-income countries or landlocked countries, are struggling much more than advanced economies because they will need to spend more time to recovery due to the lack of resources and technology. So some research reports argue that such developing countries are facing vaccine disparity problem as well, which indicates only the year around 2024, they may be able to secure the vaccines for their citizens. So how can they tackle this problem with some kind of cooperation with the advanced economies? So what would you suggest?
So who wants to take that? I mean, maybe I mean, it's always the case. I mean, my immediate response to your question is, it's always the poorest countries that suffer the most because they have the least domestic capacity for resilience. So they're always going to tend to, and they have populations that have less, their own resources are lacking, where they are living more hand to mouth. So it will always be tougher for them. So again, it just speaks to the need for the international community to step up assistance to these countries to help them weather the storm. And ironically, you know, it's probably 2020 has probably been a very good year for agencies like the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, because they're seeing a huge outflow of demand for their loans to get through this time. That said, then again, it leads to ultimately issues with respect to the debt being accumulated by these countries. So yeah, I guess those are some initial thoughts. Yeah, we live in an unjust world, and unfortunately, you know, COVID has exacerbated inequalities both across different groups within economies, and then across economies. I don't know. Anybody, Sam or Jawar?
Yeah, I share your opinion, because these developing countries are in a very weak position because domestic savings are always low. If they had enough savings within their economies, what they can do is continue to buy their government bonds. And then in that case, these economies can self-sustain themselves. But as he said, or as you mentioned in your question, if you live on hand to mouth, then how do you buy a government bond, although the interest rate might be high?
Yeah.
And the other aspect of the problem is that even if the local economy, they have enough savings, and then there is international imbalances, it affects the exchange rate. So a government bond issued in the local currency will not be that attractive when the exchange rate is seeing some kind of volatility in the market. And that creates a problem for some of these emerging economies, because most of the people will not buy the government bond. They will rather probably take the dollar and then put it in their banks or save the dollar somewhere. That is another problem that they have. there is, okay, Professor Jawad.
Thank you,
Yes.
Professor Lamponsa. Thank you, Professor Edmund, for sharing your insight. We have a final question. This would be the last question. This is the question from one of our IR students as well. Barry asked, well, I would like to ask a question regarding the fiscal policy. Should the governments introduce more economic stimulus packages? For example, the Japanese government distributed 100,000 yen to every citizen in Japan a couple of months ago. Or should they just cut the taxes for their citizens? And the second question is also regarding the tax reduction with the example of US government. So any panelists who would like to address the question? Please, Professor Edmund.
Okay, yeah, thanks for the question. And Yuki also has a question I'm eager to get back to, but I think Barry's, in general, the advice of economists is, well, in many ways, the fiscal response that should be adopted going ahead really depends upon the magnitude of the economic crisis the country is experiencing, again, which in turn just depends upon what is COVID doing in the economy. I think in Japan's case, again, 1,000 cases a day sounds a little scary, but by global standards, it's actually an achievement. I mean, just to put these numbers in context, Japan has had fewer cases since the start of the crisis than the US is getting in a single day right now. So in Japan's case, I'd say probably there's not a huge need for another fiscal stimulus. Whereas if you look at the case of the situation, very clearly another stimulus is going to be needed. And the US is really going to have to adapt how it is behaving with respect to the crisis. So I think that fiscal response in general, when you see a major downturn in the level of economic activity being caused by an increase in cases, that means the government needs to step up and increase its fiscal stimulus in the economy. So I guess that's the immediate response was, again, it's coming at the risk of you're just pushing your level of debt even higher, and eventually you will have to repay that debt. So that would be my immediate response. Yeah.
Please, Professor Lamponsa.
Okay. And I think it depends on the country. It probably might not be dashing out 100,000 yen equivalent to US citizens. But for example, if you take some of the developing countries, in the case of Ghana, the government decided to increase frontline workers' salary so that they can continue to be motivated and then work at the hospitals to fight this COVID. That is something that they've done since January to the end of the year. And that also is a way of at least bringing in some reliefs to some parts of the group of workers. The other thing is, some governments did not give out money, but reduced things like pay the electricity and water bills for households, so that because of the reduction in their income, they don't want to them to feel the effect. And in developing countries, giving out money will be a problem. Where do you stand? What data do you use to share, right? But at least everybody who uses the water or electricity from the national grid will be we have what we call the base lifeline group. If you're on the lifeline plan, then you get the full electricity being paid for you. But if you are above the lifeline, it is half of your electricity that was being paid by the government. And then water bill for everybody, it was taken care of. And these are some of the measures that developing countries can take. However, as we said, it also adds up to the debt, the debt level that you have. So to what extent can you continue to do that? And probably we don't know at the present day.
Thank you so much, Professor Lamponsa. Professor Chen, would you like to make any concluding remarks on any questions?
Yeah, So basically, I agree with the same and Chris with the answers for the last question. And so I still want to highlight that it depends. So it depends means you need to know the heterogeneous, the effects of this kind of the thing happening in each country. And then you do something called the policy targeting, right? So that's my conclusion.
Okay, thank you so much, Professors Edmonds, Lamponsa, and Chen for the very robust discussion today. I would like to thank you everyone for attending the session, and I hope to see you again in our next Global Dialogue session, which will be organized in December again. Thank you. Thank you so much.